Well, welcome back into the Radio Sport Weekender. Time to look at sport in a bit of a different view. I can introduce you to Jamie Tout, who is a strength and conditioning coach for the Black Ferns. Plus, one of the success stories of the sporting industry in New Zealand has been VX Sport, where Jamie is the sports performance director, and he joins us here on Radio Sport. G'day, Jamie. How you doing?
Very well, Matt. Thanks for having me along.
Yeah, no worries. Let's start with VX Sport, a success story. Just give the listeners out there what VX Sport actually does.
Mate, in a nutshell, we manage or monitor athlete performance, both in a physical sense, to try and work out what the demands are of different games, how far they run, how many sprints they do, heart rates, things like that. And I guess from a coaching perspective, we're always looking to try and draw conclusions back to what's the technical or tactical byproduct of that, and making sure the athletes stay on the field by making sure their workloads are managed well and reducing injuries.
How do you do it from a hardware perspective?
All the athletes wear a small little matchbox-sized device on their back in between the shoulder blades, and that's those little bumps that you'll see the athletes running around with. And that information can be either downloaded afterwards or can be sent back into the coaching box in real time, where they now can access it on any portable device to either make decisions during trainings or potentially influence what they're doing in games. And that was a big thing the AFL did a few years back, is a lot of their substitutions, which can get up as high as 120 substitutions in a game, were being governed by the physiological demands of the athlete when they were fatiguing.
Jamie, how did this come about? Whose brainchild was it, and how far has this little business gone?
Look, in 2007, Richard Snow, who's a very successful electrical engineer in New Zealand, he services a lot of the meat industry, dairy, movies, coming up with electrical engineering solutions for those industries. One of his friends or mentors, in a way, talked about developing a piece of hardware and applying it to a different industry altogether. So 2008 rolls around and Richard walks into Academy of Sport Central, which is now High Performance Sport New Zealand, and was made an introduction to myself, someone who was interested in technology. And I guess the elevator speech was he talked tech and I spoke sport. And we sat in the room for about 45 minutes before walking out. And as I say, the rest is history. We come up with a product a few months later that was released and adopted by what is now in excess of 26 countries and well over 150 teams internationally.
Lower Hutt is the headquarters. Christchurch are the hardware developers. In Auckland, I think it's the software. What sort of sports have got on board?
Yeah, the uses are very varied. We've had exposure to surfing. We've monitored a couple of Quicksilver Pro surf contests, and that data has since been used to develop the KS Wave, or the Kelly Slater Wave project over in the States, where they manufacture artificial waves. They collected data to match up against tidal conditions, surface speed, to try and replicate different wave conditions around the world. Our biggest sport to date is still soccer or football, and that probably represents around 40-45% of what we do. But probably one of our passion sports is rugby, and that's where we really cut our teeth early doors in New Zealand, working with a lot of the Super Rugby teams and Mitre 10 Cup down through Heartland, up through our national teams as well. So we've got a really diverse range. We've worked for Red Bull with downhill mountain biking, horse racing with the Wellington Cup even. So there's a lot of applications and down through education and military as well.
Jamie, is there any other product around that plays in this space, or is VX Sport the leader? I hope you'd probably say yes.
Well, I'm going to answer that two ways. Yes, there's others, but we are the leader.
Yeah.
So, mate, it is a competitive industry. Wearable technology really took off, not just in sport, but through the Weekend Warriors and everywhere else. Wearable technologies has really gathered momentum over the last sort of 5 or 6 years, particularly. We've got a couple of very, very big competitors that operate against us, but at the same time, the market is so big, there is room for everyone. That all said, there is a varying degree of other products underneath us as well, and some really probably aren't really fit for purpose when it comes to professional or even amateur sport.
As you say, the Weekend Warriors are a massive part of the sporting landscape in New Zealand, from cyclists to runners. We've just seen the running of the Wellington round the Bays. We'll see the Auckland one next week. But, Jamie, what about, have you got a product at VX Sport that looks after the amateur sports person?
Yeah, we really are the only company, I think, of the ones, the competitors we've talked about even, that we represent the professional market all the way down through amateur and secondary schools. So we have something at both ends of the spectrum, but we don't compromise on sort of what that product can deliver. So we don't change the components of what is in that cheaper model to what is in the product that the professional teams use. There's just less components sometimes, and potentially there's less function there. So whether one product might be a live device you can see in real time, whereas one might be something you bring home and download.
Physicality, does that come into it when it comes to sports? You talked of rugby. Rugby is a very, very physical sport these days. Does your hardware have the ability to stand up to those pressures?
Yeah, early on we actually ran over the devices with my four-wheel drive, and they still functioned after that and did really well. But one of the things with rugby is we need the ability now to measure impact. That is a key workload measure for us, along with things like high-intensity running, but impacts are something that we do determine how intense the training session or a game is. So the product is built to last. We're actually going through a big redesign at the moment to release a new specific rugby unit. That's sort of been at the bequest a little bit of World Rugby to make sure that the devices fall into line with all their expectations around size and function and durability.
Do coaches look at you sideways at times, especially in the early days? Do they think, well, I don't need data, I know what's going on with my athletes?
Oh, look, I'm not going to say there's not still a gut instinct to this. I think some of the data really does validate what the coach is thinking, and that does help get some buy-in around how the technology can then be applied. So it's extremely important that when we use any technology, we try and find out ways of how it can be applied in the technical sense, and don't leave the physical standing over there by itself. And an example of that would be that as a strength and conditioning coach, we will measure high-speed running loads. That might be anything the athlete does over 15 k's an hour. Now, that might have a direct correlation back to how many contests the athlete might arrive at, whether that's a breakdown situation or making a tackle out of a line break. Then we try and draw a conclusion as to how many contests have arrived at and how many they've been successful at. So just because they're covering more metres doesn't mean they're actually winning more ball or retaining the ball. And what is it, a successful outcome or a negative outcome? And there might be a correlation to say that the athlete's covering more metres, they're actually under more fatigue, they're getting there, they've got no positive influence on the game. So every time we look at measuring something new, the challenge to us is saying, well, what does that relationship look like to the coach? And are we going to get their buy-in by measuring this? And is there a positive outcome on the team's performance because of it? And are we going to win more games? That's the bottom line. We keep the athlete on the park and win more games.
Speaking to Jamie Tout, the strength and conditioning coach, not just for the Black Ferns, but also the sports performance director at VX Sport, which we're talking about at the moment. We'll get to his career in this field shortly. Jamie, from a stats point of view, I followed the AFL quite closely. We hear guys running up to 19 kilometres in a game. The sports that you guys look after, what sort of, I suppose, endurance are these athletes putting themselves through? Let's start with football.
Yeah, so football's an interesting one. We still see a disparity between levels, and that's going to happen. We expect to see that, whether it's the club game or whether it's the international game or the A-League. And probably right now we're seeing slightly more distances covered still in the EPL compared to the A-League, but we maybe see a comparable volume of high-intensity running. Whereas at your club level, you might see an equivalent amount of distance, but no real high-intensity running.
Yep.
And I think that's really the level of detail we start getting into, is not just looking at one number in isolation. We try and make sure that we draw that back to giving it some context. And I guess cricket's another really good one that we've done a lot of work with over the years. We're in a test match, and this may be quite a surprise to a lot of people. They seem reasonably sedentary, the athletes. But a wicketkeeper, as an example, will be going over 25 kilometres in a day of test cricket. A fast bowler's going upwards of 17, 18 kilometres in a day of test cricket. You compare that, though, to T20, where the athlete's only covering between 6.5 and maybe 9.5 or 8.5 kilometres. The amount of high-intensity running on the athlete now for T20 has gone through the roof.
Yeah.
You'll notice that often fielders have a designated fielding position, so you're going long on to long on. So that the amount of running they're doing at speed has gone up dramatically. So look, there always needs some context around these numbers. It's not something you look at and just say, well, one athlete's travelled 5Ks and one's travelled 10, so the guy that's done 10 has done more work or has had more influence. That's often not the case.
Can you give us, I suppose, any athletes that you've seen in your time doing this that have blown you out of the water from, I suppose, endurance meets intensity perspective? I mean, we know what sort of stuff Richie McCaw put himself through. Is there a special athlete or athletes out there that you've seen, Jamie, who you're like, this is unbelievable, these statistics?
Yeah, look, I think it's a really good question, because to answer it in terms of distance covered, you look at the Blackburns and say someone like Salika Winiata is regularly top of the pops when it comes to distance travelled. She does a lot of sprints, but she won't do a lot of contact. So then you compare her against someone like a Sarah Goss playing at 7. She won't do the same amount of distance as Shorty Salika, but she'll go through a lot more body impact.
Yeah,
probably 4 to 5 times as many. We look at overall workload, those two athletes are actually really, really similar, and they're both extraordinary in their own rights around what they bring to the table, but they actually achieve their load in very, very different ways.
You can monitor, am I right in saying you can put one of these devices on, let's say, Owen Franks' back, and you can monitor his running, but also monitoring his impact hitting rucks and getting up and going to the next ruck, etc.?
Yeah, and that was really a big missing part of our pie. Like we often found that when we're looking at workload scores, they were benefiting, or they were sort of favouring more so the outside backs. The things we were measuring were the sprints, were the high-speed running, and it was the distances they were covering. Now that we've changed that focus a little bit to monitor things like the number of accelerations and the number of impacts, we're seeing a lot more alignment between what the backs numbers look like and the forwards. And that's the ongoing argument. You've always got the forwards giving the backs grief and vice versa around who's doing the most work. So the impacts is a big one. It's something that we don't try and tag a magnitude of impact to the device, because there are so many other things that can affect magnitude, and that they're things like duration, where the contact was sustained, the angle in which the athlete was hit at, all those different things. So we more count how many impacts occurred and what that might be doing to the body, what sort of tax does that put on the body.
Jamie Tout joining us here on the Radio Sport Weekender. Jamie, to your own career, how did you get involved in all this sort of stuff, and has it always been an interest to you?
Yeah, honest truth was probably 14 days out from starting university. I actually didn't know where I was going or what I was going to be studying. I did think it was going to end up in the sports industry, but I actually was lucky enough to get a phone call from an Aussie university who I ended up attending, and they'd seen my PE marks. They must have ignored my English ones, but they saw the PE marks and got an invite. I studied over there for 3 years, and both in majoring in biomechanics and sports coaching, but finished off with an education degree as well. And something that really rang true to me early or late in my education through high school was the ability to convey information. And I always thought, look, it's always good having the knowledge, but being able to relate that back to the athlete and find that meeting was going to be really important. So hence why I took on an education degree and actually taught for a little while. It was only in 2000 that I set myself up as a strength and conditioning coach, and probably back then was coined a personal trainer.
Yeah.
And my business started out where I was looking at 20% sport and probably 80% general public. And fortunately, I found a niche in speed and agility training, and over the course of the next 2-3 years, got myself more involved with sport, and that client base turned around quite quickly, and to the point where in, I think, 2004-05, I started working with High Performance Sport New Zealand across a variety of their national programs, anything from sailing to rugby, which is where I spend a lot of my time now.
Jamie, it's interesting though, isn't it? And a big tick in your CV is now the World Cup winning Black Ferns. One, how did that job come about? And two, give the listeners an insight into the program that led them to win that title.
Mate, I was sitting in a hotel room in Dubai, probably about 4 a.m. after suffering a bit of jet lag, and got a phone call from Richard Scully. Sculls was the campaign manager for the Black Ferns prior to the 2014 World Cup, and he asked me who I thought might be a good option to give a call and take on the Black Ferns S&C role, and I said, well, I'll do it. And it was, so I didn't put anyone else's name forward. I selfishly grabbed that myself and got alongside the Black Ferns prior to that 2014 World Cup, and was there for, I guess, the despair and the heartache of being rolled by Ireland prior to the final stage. And look, as far as necessary evils go, that was probably one of them. It was very hard to swallow at the time, and the group of athletes there were no less passionate than the ones that we had in 2017. But it really gave us a bit of a reality check around what was going to be required going forward, not just to win a World Cup, but in women's rugby as a whole. I guess I could talk for a very long time around what that World Cup last year meant to the team, the community, and myself, and everyone that was involved. But there was some really watershed moments that probably occurred in 2015 when Glenn Moore come on board.
Yep.
And Glenn brought with him a Super Rugby experience and probably a level of a tactical understanding that was really elevated us to the next level. And I think the athletes bought in very quickly to the way that Glenn coached, and he wasn't coaching a female side, it wasn't coaching a male side, it was coaching the rugby athlete, and he didn't treat them any differently. It was all about, right, what's going to be allowing this amateur team to be the most professional we can, and a phrase that Glenn uses is a stink of professionalism. So over the course of that sort of next 3 years, we had to try and work out what decisions we're going to make around using our budget as best we could to be the most professional amateurs we could be. And it was things like making a decision, do we fly business class, or do we go over a few days early and actually acclimatise to where we're going a little bit better? And that's one example of something that saved us money, but was also the best for the team. It actually gave us an ability to get there sooner and prepare a lot better. So there's a lot of things that changed from 2014 to 2017. There's a lot of systems introduced, but probably something that I will look at even leading into our preparations this year is just understanding our own individual roles. And I think from a management perspective down through the players, we all got a lot better at doing that. And Glenn really drove us hard to try and find ways of evolving our role to benefit the team. And we did that through looking at data in different ways and breaking the team down to operate as individual operating units and try and really refine what we did.
What would you do with women's rugby, Jamie? I asked in a way where I think, how do you continue the momentum you gathered last year? Because at the moment, we just kicked off Super Rugby. We ain't seen a lot of women's rugby being played around the traps or on TV screens.
Yeah, look, last year provided a huge, amazing catalyst, I guess, to have a lot of discussions through the RPA, New Zealand Rugby, and all the provincial unions around what the landscape of women's rugby looks like going forward. And I think something that we'd all like to see happen faster and sooner, but the reality is, to get this right, it is going to take a little bit of time. The exciting thing is that we've got we'll be able to announce a really full international calendar in the coming weeks. We'll be able to start talking about sort of how the landscape is going to change and opportunities that will be available for players in the future. And if you look around other women's sports, like the Women's AFL, the W League Soccer, the NRL starting their own women's competition, we are starting to finally see this all come to fruition. So I think we are getting that momentum, and it is something we are going to be able to sustain. But I think everyone was captured last year by not just winning the World Cup, but the way in which it was done. It was a quality game of rugby. It was the skill level was high. The way in which the team come back and transform that second half, which was a well-laid plan, but the way in which they transformed that second half and the way in which they won the World Cup really did capture the imaginations of a lot of people.
They must have been well strengthened and conditioned, eh?
It was a part of what the team did, mate. It was like, when I say when Glenn challenged us, one insight I'll give you is that I was probably always looking at an entire training session or an entire game. What was the demands on the team for that entire game? But we had a couple of long conversations around, well, you know what? It's what the game actually demands over a full game is probably not what our potential is. Our potential probably lies in what happens in a in a 5-minute or a 10-minute window. We started going back over our data and looking at for how hard was the hardest 5-minute block or 10-minute block of training or games that we played in, and what was that made up of? And that completely changed our focus around what was required in training sessions. And Glenn and myself and Wes Clark and Grant Keenan and the medical team as well started looking for ways that we could replicate those really hard 5 and 10-minute blocks in training, which made us better prepared and brought us up to that next level.
Jamie, a couple of quick ones before I let you go, and thanks for your time on Radio Sport. Fantastic insight. I want to ask you this very quickly. Has sport become too complicated? That's part one of the question. And two, should this sort of stuff and sport in general, because it's such a massive industry now, be available for students at college level to study?
Two questions I'm really passionate about because, look, I don't think it has become too complicated. I think we do need to do less things more. We can't keep doing everything that comes across our desk. We have to keep looking at what the new theory is, what the new piece of kit is, and challenge our thinking as to, well, is that going to let us win on Saturday? If the answer is no, then we simply can't include it in the program. We can understand it, but it doesn't mean we include it. And when we talk about the KISS theory, about keeping it simple, it doesn't mean there's lack of detail.
Yep.
Like since 2014, I think we introduced 14 or 15 new systems into the Black Ferns, and realistically, had we have done that in 2015 all at once, then it would have been too complicated. It wouldn't have worked. By the time 2017 rolled around, that detail actually became very simple for the athlete. They all understood it. So when there was a massive change in that World Cup final at half time, no one didn't see it coming. No one was put off by it. It wasn't because it was complicated. Everyone was prepared to do it. So I think at the grassroots to your question, sport isn't necessarily complicated. It's still about hitting a ball in a hole or getting a ball over a line. But it's trying to work out the systems that sit behind it and making sure that they're well understood, there is clarity, and people buy into it. Do you have any follow-up for that?
No, that's bang on. No, it's just, again, finally, though, vxsports.com. If people do want to get in touch with you, Jamie, and learn more about it from, maybe an association out there's listening to this, how do they do it? And I suppose, what can you offer?
Yeah, sure. Jump on to vxsport.com, or we are available on Twitter, just under vxsport. We've got a pretty active international community there now, which is always great to see those teams or the VX family sort of following us and getting us out there. But I guess the second part of your question and to finish up was around, should we be getting this data into schools? And I would be encouraging schools to look at VX Sport and think about ways in which we can use data to teach. And I know there's a great example with Brian Evans up at Kelston Boys, where they've been wearing VX Sport devices with their first 15. They get the physical data out of there with the PE department to work out how hard was the game, how can we plan the week's training. But then they send that data off to the maths department, and the maths department break the data down to develop calculations around average heart rate or heart rate variability. They send that data off to the science team, and they look at how forces are produced. They look at the raw data on the accelerometers or the GPS and work out from a science perspective how they can use data to teach. The English department pick up the stats, and they write cool lesson plans or stories for the school to make infographics. So I guess whilst we've talked about sport a lot today, the application I see in data and how we use technology is really vast, and I think there's a massive application to education. And there's nothing surer than if it's your data you're looking up on a piece of paper or up on the board, you become really engaged. And I think that's what Brian and Kelston have done really well. They've found students who may have not learnt maths or science in the traditional way, but since introducing technology into the school and using data to teach, they're getting a lot more success around not just academics, but sports performance as well. Success around not just academics, but sports performance as well. Success around not just academics, but sports performance as well. Success around not just